Thank you for tuning into the European Guanxi Podcast. We bring together young scholars, professionals, and experts to talk about the evolving relationship between the EU and China. To dive deeper into this theme, be sure to catch our new episodes every 2 weeks. Welcome to the European Guanxi community.
Okay, so we are European Guanxi, an organization that gathers young scholars, professionals, and experts on EU-China relations. So the Shangri-La Dialogue is one of these events that our community closely follows. And in today's episode, we are turning our attention to one of the most significant defense summits in Asia. So this Shangri-La Dialogue, which is held annually in Singapore. And in just 10 days, we will have the chance to analyze this annual gathering, considered a barometer of regional and global security dynamics. So what exactly is the Shangri-La Dialogue? So launched in 2002 by the International Institute of Strategic Studies, it brings together defense ministers, military commanders, diplomats, and journalists from across 50 countries. And in this episode, we will examine the topics of interest for this year's forum and analyze the evolving balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. So today we are honored to welcome a very special guest, Monsieur Philippe Le Corre, a leading expert on China's global strategy and competition in the Indo-Pacific. So Philippe, you are a professor of Asian Studies at ESSEC Business School, a senior fellow at the Asia Society, and associate researcher at Harvard University. Through your experience at Publicis and at the French Defense Ministry, you have extensive experience in the private, academic, and policy-making sectors. So, Philippe, thank you very much for joining us today. It's a real pleasure to have you on the podcast.
My pleasure. Very nice seeing you both.
Thank you very much. And so my first question, of course, would be, how closely do you follow the Shangri-La Dialogue each year?
So it is a private event, but as far as private events go, this is probably one of the most followed summits of this type. And you mentioned that I did spend some time in the French Ministry of Defense. This is really alongside perhaps the Munich Security Conference that took place in February, and that usually takes place every February in Europe. This is the sort of Asian counterpart of the Munich Security Conference. And there's also another dialogue, the Manara Dialogue, that the IISS organizes in the Middle East, in Bahrain. But the Singapore one is very special because, as you know, it's a very tense environment in the South China Sea and, in the Taiwan Strait and, between the two Koreas, between India and China. I'm sure we're going to talk about all of this. But this is the one venue where the Chinese, the Americans, the Southeast Asians, the Indians can actually sit together in the same room and exchange about security issues. Usually, this is the place where the U.S. Senior representative, generally the Secretary of Defense, and the Chief China representative was most of the time the Defense Minister of China. Either have a dialogue, or maybe they don't sit in the same room, but their narrative would echo to each other, and that will lead to a lot of comments. Because, as you know, we live at the time of the great power competition that is taking place, especially between the People's Republic of China and the United States. And it hasn't changed since the election of Donald Trump, rather the contrary.
Thank you very much. So it is true that the Indo-Pacific has become a pivotal arena for global power competition, as you said, where geopolitical interests and economic goals converge. So the intensifying rivalry between the US and China highlights this region's critical role, as both powers seek to expand their influence through defense strategies, economic alliances, and technological advancements. So in 2009, President Barack Obama introduced the East Asian Strategy, commonly known as the Pivot to Asia, signaling a profound shift in U.S. foreign policy. So no longer centered primarily on Europe, U.S. defense priorities increasingly turned toward the Indo-Pacific. And since 2011, the U.S. has negotiated access to 12 new defense sites in the Philippines and Australia, built new installations in Japan and Guam, and expanded numerous existing bases across the region. So, according to your perspective, what key factors or events triggered this strategic reorientation? And how has US engagement evolved over time, especially in light of the 2022 National Security Strategy, which frames the region as the epicenter of 21st century geopolitics?
Well, obviously, you've said it right. I mean, at the end of the Obama presidency, you had the pivot to Asia, which was in fact a continuation of what Hillary Clinton had been doing with her key advisor on Asia, Kurt Campbell, who was also back in government during the Biden administration as Deputy Secretary of State. um, the Americans found out that China was on the rise in the region and were trying through different ways to what should I say, kick out the Americans, perhaps, or perhaps become the dominant power in the Indo-Pacific. In fact, this notion of Indo-Pacific is a fairly recent one. We used to speak about the Asia-Pacific, but the Indo-Pacific, which includes, of course, India, but also most countries in Southeast Asia and in Northeast Asia, with the exception of China, is a notion that is supposed to counter the rise of China. So another expression that the Americans have used was the rebalancing towards Asia, which basically reflects the idea that the U.S. Under either Democrats or Republicans has focused on Asia as the key driver of global economic growth as well as strategic stakes. And so this is not a surprise to anybody who's been following Asia for years. There are signs that the economic activity has been rising fast. And if you look at growth rates particularly, but also the trade influx and from Asia to Europe or from Asia to the Americas, is basically either on the rise or steady, while in Europe the economic activity has been quieter, and so this is a logic of many years, which is now reflected in the political and strategic priorities of the United States. You mentioned the national security strategy of President Trump, Trump 1.0. And it is true that for the first time at the beginning of his term, I think it was in 2017, the White House clearly established under the National Security Advisor at the time, H.R. McMaster, that the Indo-Pacific was the priority, and that China, was the clear strategic competitor of the United States. So this is the first time that things were clearly put in place, and the defense strategy followed suit as well for the Pentagon. And since that, for the past 6 years, 7 years, it's only been a steady rise on both sides, and also a steady rise for the Chinese military in quality and quantity.
Thank you very much for your response. And I think that key members of the Trump administration, some of them view containing China as a top foreign policy priority. And official visits by the U.S. Secretary of Defense in March 2025 in Tokyo and Manila have signaled a renewed emphasis on strategic ties with Japan and the Philippines. However, Trump's transactional approach to security, so demanding that allies contribute more financially for U.S. defense support, has raised concerns among partners about the long-term reliability of American defense commitments, notably in Taiwan. So how would you assess the current strength of U.S. alliances in the Indo-Pacific? And could Trump's foreign policy style critically damage historical defense ties?
So obviously, you look at the map of the region, you have U.S. bases, first of all, in the U.S. territory of Guam. Secondly, in Japan, in Okinawa mainly. Thirdly, in South Korea with some 28,000 U.S. troops. Fourthly, in some smaller bases in Southeast Asia, particularly in the Philippines and in Singapore. And a few more. But obviously, whether this would be enough to contain China, whether, if there were some serious conflict between the US and China is open to question. There is, of course, a very close partnership between the US and Japan since World War II, but now Japan is allowed to have its own defense ministry and mechanisms, and in fact has been increasing steadily its defense spendings. Same thing with South Korea. And also, I forgot to mention Australia, which is, of course, a little further away, but which indeed is playing a key role in the Indo-Pacific strategy. You know that the Pacific Command of the U.S. Navy used to be based, which is still based in San Diego, is now recalled the Indo-Pacific Command. And the Indo-Pacific region is a huge region that includes, for all the way from India, as I said earlier, to the South Pacific, which includes Australia and New Zealand and other countries of the region. But also, I should add that there is a mechanism called AUKUS, which includes Australia, the UK, and the US, which helps Australia to enhance its military cooperation with the US, and especially building submarines, nuclear submarines, which we don't know when they will come out, but this is a critical side of the cooperation between the US and Australia. And this is another mechanism that is, of course, showing that the US is rallying allies in the region, in a region that is also being competitive for both China and US allies.
And do you think that Beijing perceives these alliance fluctuations as a weakening of regional deterrence? And might that embolden its actions?
So you're right in the sense that since Donald Trump came back to the White House in January, we're not really sure how committed he is to these alliances, because there have been signs coming out of the president himself that perhaps, in the case of Japan, of South Korea, of Taiwan, that they may have to contribute further to their own defense, and that in this sort of deal-making type of policy that Donald Trump has launched, he's been pushing for these allies to contribute more, to pay more in a way, to benefit from US defense systems, but paying more, contributing more. At the same time, if you take India, for example, India's defense strategy has been to split its supplies from different suppliers, including from Russia and from France. So that means they are not depending too much on U.S. Armaments, and unlike many other countries, such as those I mentioned, Australia, Korea, and Japan, and the Philippines now, of course, has reopened some U.S. bases after closing them 30 years ago. I remember when in the 90s, Subic Bay and Clark Bays were closed down by the Filipino government because um, the area was considered as safe, and then the Filipinos didn't want the Americans anymore. But they have actually called them back, so that's also a sign that things are not as um, peaceful as they were.
Thank you very much. And given the current U.S.-China tensions, do you see the Shangri-La Dialogue as a meaningful space for de-escalation and diplomacy, or more as a stage for strategic messaging and posturing?
So it is an opportunity for people to engage in conversations. Singapore has become a key place for conversations between India and China, between the West and China, of course, Southeast Asia. This is a key member of ASEAN. So, and there will be also defense ministers coming from Europe. The keynote speech will be made by President Emmanuel Macron of France, which is, of course, very significant. I'm sure we're going to talk about that too. And France has a strong presence in the Indo-Pacific. So I'm sure it will emphasize the role of, of Europe, of the EU, in the region, and particularly of France, which has a strong maritime domain, among other things. So I believe it's going to be an opportunity for Macron perhaps to play a role between these two powers. At least that's his hope. But in terms of the U.S. and China, we don't know yet who's going to be representing China. Usually they wait till the last moment, but probably I would say at a fairly senior level, because the Singaporeans and the IISS make sure that they get the best representatives. I mean, John Shipman, who's the chairman of IISS, has been very, very good at organizing these summits. You know, I used to work with him in the Ministry of Defense, and I know how persuasive he can be.
Well, thank you very much. And as you noted in your recent article for Le Grand Continent, China seeks to position itself as a pillar of stability and development for countries in the so-called Global South. So through the Belt and Road Initiative, Beijing promotes infrastructure-led growth and regional integration. So over 25 countries in the Asia-Pacific, such as Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam, have signed onto BRI partnerships. So in your view, does the BRI also serve implicit or explicit military goals for China, particularly in strategic ports like Gwadar in Pakistan or Ream Naval Base in Cambodia? And to what extent do you believe that this issue is raised as a concern at the Shangri-La Dialogue?
So, the Belt and Road Initiative was launched in 2012 by President Xi Jinping, and it has had a sort of a bumpy road somewhat, but also successful in some ways. It depends where, and it's worked well in South Asia, for example. If you think about Pakistan and Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, it has worked well in regions like you mentioned Laos and Cambodia. It has also worked in Indonesia. When you look at some of the infrastructure projects that have been achieved there, in Java Island, for example. But at the same time, it has become an instrument for China dealing with the global South as opposed to dealing with the whole world. If you recall, for example, the original idea of the Belt and Road was to connect Europe and China, or China with Europe rather, via Central Asia, and also via the maritime Silk Road that went from China via the Indian Ocean all the way via the Suez Canal, the Mediterranean, and Europe. These days, there is still, as I said earlier, a massive trade, maritime trade between China and Europe. But whether it has anything to do with the Belt and Road, I'm not sure. On the other hand, um, uh, the Belt, which is basically the corridor from Western China to Europe via Central Asia, Kazakhstan particularly, is working fairly well. But of course, it's more costly to carry goods via train than via container ships. Um, and it is now being proven that China is not only investing in ports or infrastructures for economic reasons, but also to rally some influence and to establish more influence in some countries. For example, if you take Sri Lanka, it does have a 99-year-old concession with the government, the municipality of Ambatota, which is the name of a port in Sri Lanka. That means the Sri Lankan government or the local municipality cannot get out of that deal because of the costs for Sri Lanka, which cannot afford to pay back the loans by China. So this is obviously engaging Sri Lanka or Pakistan, for example. Lately, we heard about the India-Pakistan 4-day war that took place, and there were talks about the Chinese presence in Sri Lanka and how Chinese jet fighters were involved in the strikes from Pakistan to India. So everything has become interconnected, and China is definitely involved in many situations internationally. China is also involved in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America. So therefore, the Belt and Road Initiative is just one of the many tools it has to develop its influence, its economic influence. But economics doesn't go without other tools, including what we call soft power, but also sharp power, which is the power of information and building a narrative in a country, which usually speaks favorably to China.
And China's narrative of community with a shared future for mankind emphasizes this economic development over political engagement. And in contrast to the US model, Asia generally avoids involvement in foreign conflicts. Its base in Djibouti remains the only declared overseas military facility to date. Do you foresee China expanding its military footprint abroad, either through the establishment of new overseas military bases or through military assistance?
So military assistance, yes, there is besides the Djibouti naval base, which is quite massive, really. And as you know, Djibouti which is very conveniently located in the corn of Africa, is attracting not only China, but also the US and France, and even Japan as a small one. So it's kind of crowded there. But China obviously has a lot of interest in the region. If you look at Ethiopia, for example, when it maintains a number of infrastructures and many countries in Africa. So it is basically linking its economic presence with this military base. And so far, I don't think the Chinese military in Djibouti has been active, per se. But there is now a possibility for China to get involved in some possible conflict in the region. As far as other continents are concerned, I'm thinking of the South Pacific, for example, where there have been talks between China and different countries, Solomon Islands, Vanuatu, some smaller islands where China offered basically to pay for a new military naval base and try to convince the governments of these islands to host a Chinese military presence. That hasn't been successful so far, but who knows? This is a region, the South Pacific, far away for many powers, and China is becoming more active in that region. And last but not least, in Africa, where not only have Chinese military peacekeepers for the United Nations, China being one of the most active members of the UN. These Chinese peacekeepers, by the way, do not do very much. They are just sitting there and receive money from the UN. And some of it comes from the Chinese contribution, but they are not interfering in local conflicts. So they are gaining some experience, but they are not active peacekeepers, I think. The other interesting aspect of Chinese military presence in Africa is they have now a more extensive network of Chinese military attaches in small countries. Like recently, they opened a new posting in Benin, for example, which is a former French colony. Several African countries, as you may know, have decided to sever links with the French military, which means that the Chinese feel they're already, Africa's top economic partner. They now want to play a role also as a strategic partner. This will be helped, of course, by the massive infrastructures that they have built. For example, in telecommunications, they control, most of the telecommunications in Africa, which means that for the Chinese military, it would be quite easy to get involved in other aspects of warfare, which is now not just combating troops, but also technology oriented.
And if we now look at ASEAN countries, so 5 of them contest China's expansive territorial claims. Among them are Vietnam, Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. Despite these disputes, China maintains strong economic ties with each of them, creating a strategic dilemma. So in China, is China managing this tension through multilateral platforms like the Shangri-La Dialogue, or does it prefer bilateral diplomacy?
So as I said, the Shangri-La Dialogue is a private forum. It is not an official forum, but we need both. And there is, of course, the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, where China is involved. There are many forums on the sort of political level, including APEC, which includes countries from the United States to China, including many other East Asian countries, and even some Latin American countries, because it involves all the Pacific countries. There's also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that is based, mainly in Central Asia, but of course with a name like this, I think the next meeting will actually take place in China. And there's the East Asia Summit, that is basically a meeting of, and so there's also some smaller formats between ASEAN and the East Asian countries like China, Japan, and South Korea. So all of these are opportunities for China to play the diplomatic game, and sometimes with the West, sometimes without the West. I would say most of the time without the West. I did not mention the BRICS, because the BRICS is not just Asia, it's also Russia, Brazil, the United Arab Emirates. So it's become wider than this. So more and more you see organizations that are building next to the United Nations. Now, not exactly replacing the United Nations, but the questions are being addressed on a regional basis rather than global basis.
So as you said, unlike NATO or even the Quad, ASEAN lacks a binding collective defense system. So its mechanism focus on dialogue and confidence building rather than joint military exercise or actions. Diverse security interests and alliances further complicate any move towards a common defense posture. ASEAN struggled to respond cohesively to China's gray zone tactics, such as the deployment of militia fleets and Coast Guard swarmings. Can ASEAN move toward a mutual defense pact in the future? And if not, does it risk being sidelined by more agile and security-focused groupings like AUKUS, the Quads, or US-led bilateral alliances?
Yeah, sorry, I didn't respond earlier to your question about the South China Sea and countries like those that have become very close to China. Basically, they have become dependent on China. I think the case of the Philippines is very interesting because, as I said, they have become, under the current president, President Ferdinand Marcos, they have become much closer to the United States, and their defense capabilities against the PLA in particular are extremely limited. And China is a giant. It now has the strongest navy and air force in the region, even though the United States have maybe more aircraft carriers. China now has a very strong presence on sea and in the air. So that's why they are happy to engage with the U.S. mainly as the main competitor to China in the region. There's also the role of India and Japan, which are other key players. You also mentioned the Quad, which is another mechanism where the US, India, Australia, and Japan do conduct military exercises together on a regular basis. Taiwan, of course, is not recognized as a country by almost by no one. But it does benefit from a special relationship with the U.S., which will be crucial in case of a conflict with China, and of course the proximity between Taiwan and Japan is also a very important factor. Should there be a Chinese aggression against Taiwan, the U.S. forces in Okinawa and also the Japanese military may be asked to contribute or to play a role. And this is, of course, not something to to look forward, because that would really disturb the supply chains, the logistics, the maritime trade routes, all of this in the region, which doesn't need, any military conflict to destabilize the whole environment.
So you mentioned China's maritime dominance. So it's true that China is significantly expanding its military capacities with projection of possessing over 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. And the PRC is also heavily investing in artificial intelligence, big data, and quantum technologies, integrating those technologies in its defense systems. And China is also accelerating in space programs and currently operates around 500 intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance satellites. So this rapid modernization of the PLA raises critical questions for Asia-Pacific countries. Faced with escalating great power competition in the region, are these states choosing to align with China or the US, or are they instead seeking to bolster their defense capabilities to maintain strategic autonomy?
So strategic autonomy is probably a very ambitious project for Southeast Asia, and ASEAN obviously is the closest you can get to a kind of Pan-Asian organization that have some kind of common chart of principles, and certainly a lot of trade negotiations, but it is not a political or even less military organization. If you look at the 10 members of ASEAN, you have countries run by military junta, some with democratically elected leaders, some that are run by communist parties like Vietnam and Laos, and you even have a kingdom in Brunei, a sultanate. So for those countries which also have very different sizes, if you look at Singapore, for example, and if you look at Indonesia, which are two neighbors, Singapore is very important as a sort of economic and as a hub, an economic player. It does also have a fairly strong defense, but it's a small state. It's an island state. While Indonesia is the world's second largest first largest Muslim country, and that has a massive population and potentially could become a big market and a fairly substantive power. So I think, each of these countries have their own defense plans. Europeans have also been active in supplying military equipments to some of them, to Singapore, to Malaysia, to the Philippines, to Indonesia. I'm thinking of France and Germany, but also the UK in particular. It is important for these countries to not to rely too much on just China and the US, but to look at other players. And of course, the Europeans, they may not be, strongly involved politically in the region. They have a strong defense industry, and they are neither the US, neither China, which means for some of these countries, I was referring earlier to India also, and they like this idea of not having to choose between the two superpowers.
And we wanted to also analyze more the cybersecurity parts of the military.
Right.
So Asia-Pacific states have become increasingly vulnerable to a variety of cyber attacks, um, such as cyber-enabled espionage operations or disinformation campaigns. Singapore has advanced strategy maturity in its military cyber forces with its digital and intelligence service. India and Japan are making progress with respectively a new joint doctrine for cyber operations and a new policy on offensive cyber activities. Countries like Indonesia and the Philippines are at earlier stages in developing their military cyber strategies. So how do cyber strategies influence the broader balance of power in the Asia-Pacific? And could cyber cooperation become a new form of security alignment or competition in the region?
So this is a very good question that will be dealt with at the Shangri-La Dialogue and in many other forum, because the competition, the rivalry between the U.S. and China is also on technology. You cannot limit yourself to diplomacy and traditional military, but the cyber is aspect is critical. As you know, China has made a priority of um, 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 AI, artificial intelligence, various technologies, all the way from its Made in China 2025 strategy. And it is starting to show that, it is also very efficient in these technologies. And there is a risk that, of course, many of these technologies would be used for a military purpose, not just civilian. Thinking of drones or dual technologies that could be applied to the combat field, or at least some surveillance mechanisms. In terms of cyber, yeah, it is true that China has also a lot of tools at its disposal. If you live in Taiwan, for example, the chance that your phone or your social media or your internet access will be disturbed by China is actually very high. There's obviously a number of trolls that are being used by China, and the Philippines at the moment, I feel, doesn't have enough capabilities to defend itself against cyber attacks. So this is something where ASEAN should probably increase its cooperation, its dialogue, and also spendings. Because if you don't spend, then of course ASEAN will be left behind and will not be the capacity to resist these various cyber attacks.
And before this question, you introduced the role of European countries. And so at European Guanxi, we also talk about Europe. So I would like to focus more on the EU's engagement. So in 2021, member states endorsed a strategy for cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. And security and defense is one of the top priority areas to deepen this relation between the Indo-Pacific and the EU. So what factors are driving the European Union increased engagement in the zone? And do you believe that Europe could play a more active role in the region's stability?
Yeah, so I mean, as I said, I mean, in this world of U.S.-China competition, you need other players. Otherwise, this is going to become toxic. And I think the Southeast Asians are the first victims of this toxic environment, so to speak. So the EU has launched its um, Indo-Pacific strategy, as you said, in 2021. Now, obviously, this came from originally a French Indo-Pacific strategy, followed by a German Indo-Pacific strategy and a Dutch Indo-Pacific strategy. Now, not all the countries that are members of the EU are members have started this kind of uh, strategy. But at least, if you're a member of the EU, you cannot sort of avoid hearing about the Indo-Pacific. There have been a number of meetings in Brussels and in the region. So, in this very changing context, it's very important that the EU becomes more than just a talking shop or a trade body. So France, of course, is a special player because it has the world's largest maritime domain. It has a physical presence in the South Pacific, especially in New Caledonia and Polynesia, in the Indian Ocean. France has also some territories, and altogether there are 1.6 million French citizens living in the region. And I think about 20,000 or 12,000 military, more or less in the region. So that means France could play a small role, particularly in the Indian Ocean, I think. A little bit less in the Pacific, because obviously France is a medium-sized army and cannot do very much if there was a war going on. We have to be realistic about this. Germany has sent some frigates occasionally, but that's pretty rare. And same thing with the Dutch. So altogether, and if you add the UK, which is also having problems of funding, but as you know, as members of NATO, all these countries are supposed to reach the 2% share of their GDP. And now even more, if you listen to the Trump administration. So in the case of Poland, it's 4%, but Poland doesn't do very much in the Indo-Pacific. So it's mainly, France, the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. The others don't really count. But I think, it's very important that the EU comes up with some kind of Indo-Pacific strategy that is part of the EU strategic autonomy concept, which has been much debated, of course, which President Macron has addressed several times. Now, on the US side, people say, well, what's the point of having this strategy? Because financially and from a military standpoint, the EU is not strong enough to be a big player in the region. But in terms of procurement, I mentioned earlier that countries like Malaysia or Singapore and Indonesia and India have been purchasing military equipment, including Rafale jet fighters in the case of India. And from France, Germany has been, providing certain defense equipments to the region. So this is obviously, having a new player means that you are not completely dependent on the US or China. China, of course, is trying to sell more equipments to the regions, including drones, missiles, jet fighters. Well, they've sold to Pakistan. The Pakistani military is very close to China. But I think should Europe be more organized as a uh, strategic community, it would be in a better capacity to provide military assistance or even a defense industry that is capable of reaching out to the Asian region that it is now. If you take the EU defense white paper that was published on March the 19th, there are different aspects, including spending more in artillery, in drones, in military mobility, in AI, all of this, including missiles. So that would make Europe, the EU, a more credible actor. And from a Southeast Asian point of view, that would be seen as a positive, including from India as well, because everybody is trying to find, a third way, and not just looking at China on one hand and the United States on the other hand.
Thank you very much for your analysis. And one last concluding question is, what are your expectations for this year's Shangri-La Dialogue, especially?
Well, I think, first of all, let me emphasize that having President Macron as the keynote speaker is very interesting, because we've been discussing about the EU's role in the region. All the EU members may not have the same viewpoint on how to address in the Indo-Pacific, but France is the one that has perhaps the most coherent approach for a medium-sized country with its territorial presence, economic role, and strategic role, with a physical presence for the French Navy, especially. So I think people will look forward to this. People will look forward to hearing what the Trump administration has to say about the region, because sometimes, they send very conflicting signals about how would they support Southeast Asia or Taiwan in case of a conflict. Even Korea, the Korean Peninsula, has a lot of there's a high risk there with a North Korean regime that is obviously spending more on defense and playing a very disturbing role. And then last but not least, China. China's defense budget has been on the rise for the past 35 years. They will try to show the rest of the world that they are not a threatening force, but at the same time, they want to emphasize the fact that they consider Taiwan as one of their provinces, and that the South China Sea, by and large, should be under Chinese control. This is not something that, of course, ASEAN countries, especially Vietnam and the Philippines, and even Malaysia and even Singapore, want to hear. And so they will have the language. The Chinese delegation will be very interesting to monitor, and the gesture and the negotiation spirits will be interesting. Usually, the head of the Chinese delegation is a minister or a senior officer in a military uniform, speaking a tough language and showing to the U.S. particularly that they are in charge and that there wouldn't be no compromise. But there are also lots of meetings on the side. There are lots of side events organized by either the ISS or think tanks, and so overall, it is a positive opportunity for people in the region and outside to rally and to exchange. And this year, again, we are in a very tense environment with the Trump administration and his trade war, but also people talk more and more about potential risks in the Taiwan Straits in the coming 2 years. So I'm sure the question of Taiwan will be very much, in the news and also in private conversations.
Thank you very much, sir, for accepting to respond to all of my questions and also to participate in this project. I think all of the audience of European Guanxi would have a lot of content, and we'll learn a lot of about the Shangri-La Dialogue and also the Indo-Pacific region. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You've been listening to the European Guanxi Podcast. We hope today's conversation has sparked new ideas and insights for you. You can find all of our episodes on your favorite podcast app. If you like our show, please leave us a comment on LinkedIn or share us with your friends. For suggestions on new episodes, you can reach us at eguanxipodcast@gmail.com. Thank you for listening, and we look forward to seeing you in our next episode. Until then, stay connected and stay curious.